So we're back and we're going a little bit of time doing a little bit of the why of Judaism, and today we're going to do the why of prayer. But here's the thing. I was discussing this. I spent some time learning with my very good friend Ariel Blumenthal on this topic down south, and we were discussing like how do you even approach this topic, because if you're going to really learn the why of prayer, then that really is a whole separate section called Biur Tefillah, understanding the words in the prayer book, and that could be many years of work. And we've done that a few times, and it's a very important topic. But what we're going to do today is a little bit different, and that's called the why, as the audience will be somebody who walks into a shul the first time and sort of sees what's going on, and their why. So it's going to be less about what does this word mean, what is the intention of this paragraph, but more like, why are we doing all of this? And I know it sounds so obvious, but it isn't so obvious. Imagine for a second that you were not blessed to grow up and be schooled in Orthodox thought and practice, and you were to walk into a Orthodox synagogue for the first time. It is very disconcerting. Just when you think you settled in, the guy next to you stands up. So you stand up. And then as you're just getting used to it, he sits down again. And so you sit down. And then he stands up again, and this time he starts bowing down, so you kind of go down, but you don't really know when he's going to come up. And then suddenly there's like the hand and the eyes, and then there's like, he's pulling up like these strings on his side. It's getting very uncomfortable, right? So it's just like, how do you even plan for this? How do you know what's going on? So we're going to look at some of those questions, a little more of the bigger picture, the whys in general, rather than why is that in Birkas Torah that there's two sections in the first paragraph, which is very important to know, because that's a separate section called understanding tefillah. So let's start at the beginning. So let's start very very simple. First thing you notice when you walk into shul is as follows: why is it that you need to wait for 10 men? It's an interesting thing. We all go to daven and we wait for a minyan. We wait for a minyan of men. Why do we need a minyan? Why do we need a minyan in the first place? Doesn't God listen to us at all times? Is God deficient to need a minyan for him to come? He needs that enough people to be there. Why is that? How could this work? The answer is God does not need a minyan. God is not missing or lacking anything. But we're told, and if you go back to actually Avraham Avinu's negotiations with Hashem, when he starts making the prayer, the bid for people, tzaddikim, to save, worthy of saving the 5 cities, he asked for 50 people. Why 50 people, 50 tzaddikim? Because there's 5 cities, there should be 10 in each city. And the negotiations finally fail when he realizes not even 10, right? That's when it stops. You see, there's a value in the presence of Hashem in 10, among 10. But more specifically in halacha, the way it's expresses the Mishnah Megillah tells us that HaKadosh Baruch Hu requires a minyan for certain things which are called Devarim Shebekdusha, and they include Chazaras Hashatz, Kedusha, Kaddish, and Kriyas Torah. There's a few things that require a minyan, and this is based on the pasuk which says, "V'nikdashti b'soich b'nei Yisrael." I'm going to be sanctified among all of Israel. And so the question becomes okay, so when there's Kedusha, when there's Nikdashti, it needs to be B'soich B'nai Yisrael. What is B'soich B'nai Yisrael specifically? So the words B'soich actually are used, the Gemara Megillah derives it from a connection to the words describing Mitoich Ha'edo HaZois, referring to the Adas Korach, and then that's Toich, and then the parallel were called word bridge, and then it takes us all the way to the Ada, which is understood to be the Meraglim. How many Meraglim were there that were Moitzi Diba? There was 10 remaining absent of Yeshua and Kalev. And so we know that the basic framework is 10, which is a strange thing, just in case you're counting, is because we could have thought options of very worthy people who could have made the minyan, right, to be the source of minyan. But nonetheless, it uses a very depraved source. In Tanakh, Adas Korach and the Meraglim are not our benchmark of examples. So part of the reason for that is because that the minyan is not meant to only be tzaddikim, right? If it was, you could imagine what the aristocracy of the elite would be is standing by the shul door. Not you, no. So that doesn't work that way. It's very much inclusive. There are exclusions. Just understand there are exclusions, but generally speaking, the bar is actually low, as is learned from this, and that is the framework of Nikdashti B'Soch B'nai Israel, which is why we need a minyan, but not for everything, but for many things. So, for example, you don't need a minyan for brachos. You don't need a minyan for Pesukei de Zimra. You do need a minyan for the specific things that are called Dvarim Shebikdusha, when you need a quorum when there's a matter of holiness. Okay, so
that's what the Rav said. That's tzibur, tzadikim, beinunim,
very good. Exactly. So that's what it is. And tzibur is created as basic framework. That's the first question. Second question is, okay, so we have a minyan, but why shul, right? Why Beit Knesset? We have a bunch of Israelis staying with us, which is wonderful, and they said, "Ma pirush milah shul." It's maybe a Yiddish word, but Beit Knesset, right? As described in our writings of the Mishnah, as it is expressed, as referred to or implied in Tanakh. Why do we need a shul? If really my prayers can be heard anywhere, and if there's a notion of having a minyan, so I can have a minyan, in my basement at the poolside. Like, why do I need specifically a shul? Why is shul such an important space? So one specific reason is that it's usually the place of the minyan, meaning most, generally speaking, that's the place where you find a minyan. But it's more than that as well. It's we know that Yecheskel describes there was a transition that happened when the base of English was destroyed. Yecheskel describes, "V'ahi lahem, I will be to them mikdash ma'at. I will be a small mikdash." As the mikdash is absenting itself, there's going to be a place where you can have a small sanctuary, which is why the design of a shul, in fact, is made to reflect the sanctuary of old, the temple. So, for instance, even what we call here as the Aron, is the ark is actually using the word that we learn in Parshas Truma, which housed the luchos, where we house the Torah. We have what's called the bima, which is like the shulchan in the middle, perhaps the mizbech or shulchan. We have the ner tamid, which reflects the menorah. There's a lot of halachas that surround a shul and its orientation as to why it is. When we light the Hanukkah candles, we're going to light on the south side of the shul, and it's going to be facing this way, which is how the menorah was on the south side of the mikdash. As well, so a lot of what we do replicates the mikdash itself. And if that isn't of value to a person, in a certain sense, what they're saying is that aspiration in sort of sense has ended. In the Reform movement, one of the changes they made was they started calling the Beit Knesset the temple, right? So today you go temple, this temple, that temple, this, right? All these different names. And in a certain sense, what they were saying is we no longer need to aspire to a larger temple. We no longer need to aspire to being in Israel. The Reform movement was anti-Zionist for many years before it changed its resolution. But that means to say is we're here, we've made it. So there's a balance between sort of like just that aspiration for something bigger, which is found in the shul. But more than that, there's more to it as well. Another aspect is that a shul is a place which has walls which are saturated with the cries, praise, and expressions of joy of people. Which means to say is that there's decades and decades of holiness in a place, which means to say is the Wi-Fi signal is much higher, right? And just because you're in a place which is saturated by prayer as well. When I was in Kerem B'Yavne, in the Yeshiva Kerem B'Yavne, it's such a beautiful campus. There's palm trees and it's just beautiful. The whole place is gorgeous. But there used to be guys who go outside and they would pull their stender up, under a tree and learn in there. And the Rosh Yeshiva would say, he says, look, we have well over 75 years of holiness in this room. It's really, you get an extra boost. It's important to be in the costly base medrash, not just haphazard as well. There's another element to this, and that is the Gemara tells us, "Hakoveh makom litfilasai elokei Avram be'ezrai." A person who fixes a place, has a specific place for davening, then the God of Abraham is with him. We know this from the fact that when Avraham Avinu prayed for Sodom, he prayed twice. He prayed the first day we negotiated, and then he prayed even while the destruction was happening, which is directly linked to Lot escaping. If you read the Pesukim carefully. And it says, "Vayashkem Avram baboker el hamakom asher amad sham," that he goes to the place that he stood there, which means he came back, he didn't just pray, he prayed in the same place that he was on the previous day. And so the Gemara learns from this is that, okay, Avram Be'ezra, the God of Abraham, is going to help us if we replicate such actions, then we're going to be saved by the God of Abraham. And that means to say, just the notion of the idea, the importance of what's called kfios, which means commitment, which means in a singular place. And that can mean in general and specifically. In general meaning that one goes to one place at a specific time, not just haphazardly when I have time to just drive by and double park, right? And but more importantly is that also even in the shul there's a notion of a makom kavua, which means that even in the framework of a shul, of having a specific place, I've noticed this psychologically with people, is that when people daven in a different room than they usually do, they still move to the same area in the room as they usually do. That's just a psychological thing. But what the Gemara seems to be saying is it's even within the shul. And this rule exists until a guest takes your place. At which point in time, Achnos's Orachem will override your specific place, and you can find somewhere else, and that's fine. Before asking somebody else to leave your seat, but there's a great value in kfios. Now, if there's a value in a minyan and there's a value in a shul, so you say like this: well, let's say there's a shul that's happening without me, and there's a minyan that's happening without me. Then, like technically speaking, they're good, right? So like, why do I need the minyan? Meaning, B'nigdashti b'zach b'nei Yisrael Hashem, you want to make sure that when holy things are said, they're said in a minyan. They've got minyanim, they're good. They don't need me, right? There's a shul, it's all right. Like, why me? Right? Why is it necessary? So the way I view it is that for anybody who's ever spent time getting on a bus or a train to go to Washington, D.C. to lobby on behalf of Israel, right? So many times we've got an APAC and NORPAC and there's OU advocacy and Chabad's got its own advocacy arm and you do all these things. It's all fantastic, and I've actually been on the bus with many people in this room together to D.C. And it's really important. You get these meetings and you sit with Congress people, you sit with senators, and you express the importance of the values that we stand for. But like, let's imagine that instead of this, you say like, May 18th is a tough day for me, It's like, I'm just going to go myself, So you hop on a train, you get to DC, and you walk into the Cannon building, and you say, Longhorn, and you're like, I'm going to go knock on doors and ask for meetings. They're going to be like, who are you? like, since when do you just walk in? Now, technically speaking, to your congressperson, you have the rights. You still need to book a meeting, and then you'll get to speak to an intern. That's really great. But the point is that like, and let's say they give you a meeting, right? Let's say you figure out getting a meeting. First of all, let's say you even have 15-minute meetings and it all magically aligns that you get all your 15-minute meetings. You're still going to only meet so many people, right? Because you're not part of a delegation. But moreover, let's say you even get into the office. Let's say you even get to the legislative aid, or you even get to the congressperson just by yourself. For some reason, they're going to spend time with you by yourself. Let's imagine that. So then you're going to start making your case, right? But like, what are you going to talk about? Where do you start? Where do you end? What are your talking points? Like, what's really important? What bills are on the floor now at this point in time? Did you do your research sufficiently to know what's in process? The point is that as a singular person, you're good, but like, you're not really good, right? You don't really have the context enough to get the meetings, to meet the right people, and to say the right things, which is why you go with delegations. That's why it's important. Even if there's a delegation going, you're not going to be as good if you're not part of that delegation, right? It's just not working. So you can daven in, there's in what's Koisel Ma'arumi, right? And and all and the chevrusa with the Eastern Wall in our house and all those things, and it's wonderful, but it's still a delegation by yourself, which does have power, but it's not the same. It's not the same as being part of a larger delegation. That larger delegation is called V'nigdash b'zach b'nei Yisrael. So it's not because just it's happening and God needs it. It's because you need it. You need it as well, as part of that as well. Let's go a little further. What about, timing? Like, why are Jews so punitive about timing? And imagine that you're like somebody who's not initiated to this, and you look at the shul calendar and you're like, why in the world? First of all, what is this business called plague? And then it's like 3:32 and then 3:31, and like, can't you guys just get it straight? Like, in the conservative temple where I come from, it's 7:15 all year round Friday nights. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's just more reasonable, right? Like, you guys is just like suddenly, 4:13, and then the shul puts the wrong thing in the calendar, and everybody's going wild. It's like, it was 5:32, it was 5:33, but it said in the calendar the 5:32, but then it's like, guys, why are you Jews so? Like, what's the deal with timing? Why are Jews getting so uptight about things? I remember there was a comedian they once brought to APAC. Yeah, these terrible Orthodox comedians, who make fun of everything. But in making fun of Orthodox Judaism, one of the things he says, can you imagine if the Christians were Orthodox Jews? It would be what time does the tree need to be up? Like what length does the tree need to be? Right? So there's so many there's so many details. So in terms of timing, why is that? The answer is the Gemara Brachos Daf Chavav tells us that our prayer is based on two different models. One model is what's called Keneged Avos Tiknum, is that our patriarchs instituted prayer, which means we do the things like they did. Avraham Avinu got up in the morning, we get up in the morning. Yitzchak Avinu goes out in the afternoon to meditate with God in the field, we do the same. Yaakov Avinu interacts with God, he encounters the divine at nighttime. So we do all three, right? We do the morning, the afternoon, and the evening. But then there's the Gemara says there's another model, and that's called Keneged Tamidim Tiknum, which is like the Korbanos. You'll notice that and the Korbanos are very much structured. They're structured in time, they're structured in thought even, and practice. So let's say as an example, if you bring a Korban out of its time, gone, finished, it's worthless. If you bring it out of its place, it's worthless. If you bring it with intention of being out of its place or out of its time, it's worthless, right? Anybody's learning Zachem right now and appreciating what the daf is taught, it's very complicated. There's so many rules, which means to say prayer has both the organic expression of the avos, of the patriarchs and matriarchs and those who reached out their own way, and it also has the very much fixed framework of the Karbanos, because in the absence of the Karbanos, our Tefillah takes on those fixed structures, which is why the Tefillah maps precisely the halachas of Karbanos, right? So, as an example, there's a debate between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim as to when the Tamid Shel Shachar can be brought. When is the first Karban brought to the Beis Hamikdash as a communal sacrifice on behalf of all of Israel, called the Tamid, the constant Karban Shel Shachar of the morning? When is it brought? So it has to be brought after sunrise. There was mistakes made about this, and it has to be brought up till when? So the one opinion is up till 4 hours in the day, and the other is 6 hours in the day. That's precisely the same debate which is had about prayer. When can you daven shachris until? So we paskin 4 hours into the day. But if you didn't manage to do that, you have until 6 hours in the day. Precisely the time frame of our davening. Our davening is exactly a map of that. Our Kriya Shema, by the way, is not. Kriya Shema has different rules because Kriya Shema is not davening. Kriya Shema is a separate mitzvah and happens to be placed next to davening. Okay, but it has different time frame, which is why it starts earlier and ends earlier in terms of its own framework. So our davening schedule is an amalgamation of the laws of Tefillah and the laws of Kriya Shema merged together to make sure to accommodate both, which is why it's a narrower bandwidth. Okay, so that's in terms of timing. Now, why do we have Sidurim? Why is everybody pulling out a prayer book? These are the simple questions. Why do we need a prayer book? Wouldn't it be better if at the age of bar and bat mitzvah, everybody were to get a blank notebook and they were to write their prayers, right? So, and over time with life and experience and maturity, everybody would sort of carry on writing, and they'd be like, "Oh, I really like that phrase. I really like that idea. That Psalm in Tehillim really speaks to me, and that that influence." Oh, no, not that. Okay, no, we're not going there. But let's say that you put together your own prayer book. Wouldn't that be more true? Wouldn't that be more of an expression of me than it would be with some folks 2,500 years ago telling me what to say, which no longer is archaic. I don't understand the English even of what the translation is. So why do we need this? So there's a number of reasons why. The most basic reason is because if you had a blank book, guess what? You probably wouldn't say so much, right? You will have the 2% in the class who will do a fantastic job. We all know who those kids are. But the rest of the class, 98% of Judaism, won't figure out what to say for a very long time. Which means to say is there will be nothing. It'll be blank, and that's going to continue in such a way. So that's number one. But there's more to it as well, and this is described in the Ruach Chaim. Rav Chaim Volozhin has a commentary on Pirkei Avos, and he says as follows. When was the tefillah? When was the nusach tefillah fixed? It was fixed at the time 2,500 years ago by a body called Anshe Knesset Agdola. Interesting fun fact about Anshe Knesset Agdola is that on the board of that Jewish leadership board were the last of the prophets, Chaga, Zachariah, Malachi, as it happens to be. Right, that was the end of prophecy. So why at this specific stage in Jewish history did they decide to institute the prayer book? After all, they had the Beis Hamikdash, right? Anshe Gnaz Gadol were already in the times of the second Beis Hamikdash. So it was not because they just lost the Beis Hamikdash and they just lost the Karbanos. They actually had the Karbanos back. Thank you very much. So why now? So there's a couple of reasons. The Rambam says at that time it's because that they'd seen what the impact of a short exile had done. People simply did not know Hebrew. Right? They came back from Babylon, and the day school system there was not great. People were intermarrying, they were assimilated, and they were not being able to speak in the same language. They had all kinds of different languages. So they said, let's unify the system so we can withstand this type of goddess, right? So that's what the Rambam says. But the Rachav Roshan says, no, they realized like this. They realized that as prophecy was receding, then they needed to create something which would be universal with infinite depth. Meaning to say, is let's say you got the greatest poet in society to write the prayer book. It would be magnificent, fantastic, but it's still not prophetic. In order for it to work, it needs to be prophetic. Why? And the reason is as follows. Think to yourselves for a second what you were praying for 10 years ago, right? Let's think about this for a moment. Take yourselves back to that year. Think about what you were praying for then, right? If that's difficult, try 20 years, right? Try reverse 20 years for a second and say, what were you praying for then? And like, what was happening in your life? Like, what was happening with the kids? What was happening with your relationship? What was happening with your work? What was happening with your health? Or there's so many things that we can think about that if we go back those 20 years. And I guarantee that most of the things are not the same, right? Because things change. Our lives changes. Our experience changes. Our constellation in our framework of our social framework changes as well. And that's an important thing. If we were still davening for the same thing, there's something wrong because that means we haven't changed, right? We continue to change. That's in our own lifetime, right? And by the way, if you do this even more, if you just zone in and even a little more, let's say you take twins who grew up in the same house, same bedroom, they share a bunk bed, right? They eat the same food. They themselves will also have different davening, which means you need to have a prayer book which has the ability to be able to have space for all of me. Forget anybody else. All of me, just me. There's so much. And then now amplify this. Now talk about generational changes. Now let's talk about our parents' prayers. Let's talk about our grandparents' prayers. How different are they? Even, forget the 10-year span, the 20-year span in our own lifetimes. How different was what they're davening for? So different. Which means, how can you have one prayer book? How can you have one text which allows the space for the infinite expression of growth of every individual in different locales, in different experiences throughout the complexity of their life? The answer is poetry is not sufficient. Right? You need to have prophecy for that. So as they realized that prophecy was receding, they used the last of the prophets to be able to create a framework which allows us to be able to have the infinite depth within those words as well, which is why, and I'm sure we had this experience, have you ever been like to the siddur one time, you open it up and you're like, oh my gosh, that really speaks to where I am right now. But it never did before, right? Because you had this experience which helped match to the words. But that wasn't just a very good wordsmith. That was actually that's the end of prophecy. That's why it's put in the prayer book. Yeah. Okay. So that was the why we need to start. Now, why do we have a chazan? Folks, these are just the simple questions. We're not even getting to the Birat Tefillah. Why do you need a chazan? Like it should be. And I don't know if anybody's ever spent some time doing a beautiful Sfaradic Pesukei de Zimra. Oh man, they definitely have a leg up on us because they all sit in a circle and they go around, right? And that's it, and everybody actually davens, right? So and they do it together. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful thing, right? It takes a whole bunch longer, and nobody's complaining about the time because they're actually all doing it. So it's it's an amazing thing. But why wasn't all the davening like that? We should all just sit down, right? Eric was beautiful, right? And we should sit around, and for all the davening, we should just, say our stuff, right? Why do we need to have, a person in the front saying, we responding the whole business? So there's a few reasons. Historically speaking, one of the reasons is, and just as this is a social emergence, is, and Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz talks about this in his introduction to the Siddur, is that most people were not schooled. Most people were not lettered. Most people couldn't read. So therefore, it was not possible for most people to pray themselves. We take it for granted that we have education. We complain about the education system and the teachers on this and the teachers on that in the schools. Folks, just reverse a few hundred years. Most people couldn't, and by the way, Jews were the exception. We kept on studying. But even most Jews, didn't have the option of learning and studying and knowing. We're so blessed to live in an educated society today, right? So it would be, for most of human history, the Shliach Tzibur would be the person who is saying it for the people who couldn't say it. right? And specifically in Yomim Tovim, where the words are more complicated. Like who before the printing press? Who had Machzorim? Come on, right? You had one person who was able to express it on behalf of the others and say it clearly. And so that's where the Shtei Tzibur, that's one part of it. But it's more than that. It's not just functional. The Gemara tells us, in Rosh Hashanah, that when Moshe Rabbeinu in Parshas Kisisa begs HaKadosh Baruch Hu to see the way he leads the world, and the Gemara describes, based on the pasuk in the end of Parshas Kisisa, it describes Vayavor Hashem apanav, Hashem came in front of him, in front of Moshe, Vayikra, and he calls out, and this is where we get the 13 attributes of mercy. It says, Amar b'Yochanan, Ilmale Mikra Kasov, Yeshalo Amroi. If this pasuk had not said this, we would not be able to express this. What does it say? What is it? Melamed. It teaches us Hashem wrapped himself out like the leader of the community, right? And showed him Seder Tefillah, the way to daven. Anytime that Israel sins, do this and I will forgive them. Which means that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is giving us the model for how to pray, which is that there's going to be somebody who's going to lead us through the process, to show us, Melamei Hera Lohem Seder Tefillah. And that's worthy, which is why, by the way, there are laws that apply to who the Shliach Tzibur is. It's complicated. It's not just, like there's laws that specifically Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, but they overflow to the year as well, which is like, it needs to be somebody who's married. It needs to be somebody who has, technically speaking, if you look in the halacha, a zakan, a beard, right? There's a lot of laws that it needs to be a person who has children. There's a lot of laws. It's a person who's merutzei lakal. There's all these laws. Why is that? Because that person, in a certain sense, is metaphorically taking the space that Hashem did in that relationship to Moshe. Hashem was giving Moshe a lesson in tefillah, so we do the same thing. We replicate that process as well. And a lot of the responsive nature of tefillah is Baal tefillah saying something, already responding, is also very much matching that relationship of Hashem communicated with Moshe Rabbeinu in that responsive nature. Most dvarim sheb'kedusha are responsive. It goes back and forth, right? And that is as a function of this model as well. Now, why? And this also explains another why, which is why does the Baal tefillah need to wear a talis? And so answer is because in Moshe Rabbeinu's description of seeing Hashem emerge, Nisatef, Hashem wrapped himself in a surrounding light, which was an expression of what we're going to use as the talis, which is meant to be done to be replicated. So we're replicating that imagery in Parshas Kisisa as well. Why is there no talis at night? So it depends. As an example, in Arshul, on a weekday, the chazan does not wear a talis at night. On a Friday night, the Baal Tefillah does wear a talis. That's because they start before sunset with the talis on as part of Kabbalah Shabbos, which is supposed to be before sunset. And part of the reason is because, as we've discussed when it comes to the laws of tzitzis, is that tzitzis and talis are related to the day, and therefore at night it's not a time to do this. The only exceptions would be is when you start earlier. So let's say a regular Mariv, what happens is the Baal Mincha, the person who finishes the Mincha, sits down, takes off the talis. There's a Dvar Torah, so we get to Shkia, to sunset, and then a person or another person, or maybe even the same person, gets up. At that point in time, we wouldn't put on a talis because you're not putting on talis after it's sunset. The exceptions on a Friday night, like the Chadodi, which is done before sunset, or supposed to be done before sunset, and on the night of Yom Kippur and the Mincha Ne'ilah is you carry on wearing the talis because it starts in the day. But otherwise, one should not be putting it on at night. Yeah.
What about plug?
That's fine, technically speaking, it's still daytime. I mean, but that's a good question. I don't know. It's a good question. I had to research that in this respect. Now, folks, why have you noticed? This is like a question that everybody should appreciate. Is why is it? Okay, I think we have to take a moment for a quick humorous interlude. Okay, right now. Okay, so let's go back so they say this. They say the joke about George W. But I've heard it in various different versions. So George W. Bush is, he's speaking to his cabinet, and he finds out that whenever he has news, the Jews know it first, right? Like whenever he has something that's just happened in the world, like all the Jewish interns, they all know what's going on. So he's like, "What's the deal? Like, what's this? Like the mafia?" So I said, "No, Mr. President. It's very simple. What happens is that we've got this special place. It's called shul, right? And there's a way to and that's when we get all the news. And so the president says, well, like, I'd like to be part of that. I'd love to. Says, Mr. President, it's really hard to get into that club. Says, no, try me. So he says, okay. So what they do is they get in this, a special, an interpreter who comes in and explains to him like the way it goes. And he explains, look, what happens is you stand at the back, right? And you sit there with a sitter. And when it comes time to laning, what happens is you sit there, and just as they pull out the Torah, you say to the person, "Achnu vos herzach," and that's when it all happens, right? Right? So there's two times, either at the beginning of just after Kedusha, like in Chazar Sashatz, or as they pull out the Torah, and that's where all the magic happens. So what they do is they grow his hair the right way, put on a little bit, They tell him how to wear the talis. It's always very uncomfortable for people who haven't worn yarmulkes before. I don't know if you've noticed it. It's kind of a balancing act because it's not very easy. We take it for granted as Orthodox Jews that it works. But it's not always so easy. There's the double-sided tape method we heard about yesterday, right? But it's not so easy. So they get him trained, and then so on. At night the Secret Service drops him in, 13th Avenue, Borough Park. They drop him in, it's on a Monday morning. He gets to the shtibel. He's sitting at the back, and he's looking around, and everybody's like very focused. Nobody's talking. So then comes the right time, and they tell him that it's time. So he saddles up to the guy next to him, and he says, "Nu, was herzach?" So the guy looks at him and says, he says, I heard that the president's going to be in shul today. Nonetheless, the point is imagine being a foreigner. You're walking in the back of the shul and you're looking at all this stuff. What is going on? So we've still spent a little time looking at some of it, but let's look a little further. So why is it that if you go to the three prayer services in the Jewish day, the morning one is really, really much longer, right? It's like you can be done with, and that's a very terrible way of describing davening, but a lot of people think about it that way. Be done with mincha and mariv. To daven mincha mariv is, let's say 30 minutes all round, or 18 minutes depending where you're going, right? But let's say you have, but Shachris is significant. There's a lot of time. They're like, why is it so much longer? And the answer is there's 4 parts to Shachris, which you don't have the rest of the day. And they are as follows. They're what's called korbanos. Then there's Psukkah de Zimra, Kriyas Shema, and Amidah. Those are the 4 parts. And actually 2 of those parts really we don't have in the other ones. So the korbanos is where we replicate what was done in the Beis Mikdash. We talk about the korban tamid shel shachar. We talk about the kior and the trumas adeshin, and some people even learn ezer humakamon, which is the Mishnayos, which talk about the korbanos. And part of this is because we can't do the korbanos. So we express the korbanos in the hope that we will have the opportunity of being brought back to that time. That's the first section of davening. You say, wait a second, that's not the first section of davening. The first section of davening is brachos, or birkas hashachar, the blessings in the morning. The answer is not really. That's actually not the first part of davening, because if you read the Gemara in brachos and you read the Rambam in describing this, they were actually not done in shul. The birkas hashachar, technically speaking, were done in the process of waking up. So a person would put their feet on the ground, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, Rakah haaretz al hamayim. Person puts on their belt, Ozer Yisrael b'gvura. Right? Every stage of the brachos was done experientially. Today, it's been moved to shul because some people don't know it, and just because it's a better place for intention, and so on. But nonetheless, so we put it together. But that really actually was a later import. It was done more experientially. The first part of davening was really the korbanos, which is a pity because I notice that a lot of people skip korbanos. But that's actually the first part of davening. It's the most important that is to be doing the korban tamid shel shachar, and the ketores need to be said every morning. That's the very least. That's why I put in the shul's siddur. I highlighted those things and they switched the siddurs as to which part has to be said. So that's a critical part of tefillah. The next part is called Psukkah de Zimra, which literally means verses of praise or song. And the reason why we have that is because we know that the formula that Moshe Rabbeinu used in Parashas Vayeschanan when speaking to Hashem is, first you praise the Almighty to contextualize what you're about to say, and then you ask for things. Before we get to our Amidah or our prayer, we have a large section of prayers to contextualize ourselves in relationship to the Almighty, which is the second section of prayer, which takes a little bit of time between Baruch She'amar and Yishtabach. Quick question over here is, on that note, just a second-wise, why is it that the Nusach Sfarad people have a different time for Baruch She'amar than the Ashkenaz people, right? You notice that, right? So why is it that there is this? So there's a few different reasons. There's a few different reasons for this. One of these reasons is is that in most of the Nusach Sfarad is based on Kabbalistic teachings of the Arizal, which is fine. It's a latecomer in the game in terms of because it's only arrived 250 years ago, which is very recent in Judaism. But the part of the reason is that to have more people around for Baruch She'amar, right? So there should be more people present for the Baruch She'amar, which means it leaves a little bit more space for those people to be present, which is fascinating. Whereas Nusa Ashkenaz starts earlier, and so more is encapsulated in those Psukkah de Zimra, which is bookended by the Baruch She'amar. Which means, by the way, technically speaking, if you're by yourself, right, there might not be nogeh, but you don't change Nusach. But just technically speaking. Now, the third part of our davening in the morning is Kriyas Shema, and the brachas which surround. The brachas do not come with it; those are instituted at the time of Shemona Esrei. That's because the Torah tells us, you'll speak about these things, meaning the Kriyas Shema, the affirming your allegiance to the divine and your allegiance to the mitzvahs every day when you go to sleep and when you wake up. When you wake up is in the morning, that's Kriyas Shema, that's the first 3 hours of the day, and that's put there. It's interesting, why was it put there? Meaning, why was it put in this place? And the answer is because actually one of the themes of it is Geula, right? Which is the last paragraph, which is Yetzias Mitzrayim and the symbols thereof, and that has to be placed next to Tefillah, Smichas Geula Tefillah, which is the next thing, which is the Shemona Esrei. Everything afterwards is, in a certain sense, the epilogue, coming out of davening, sort of like landing after that elevation. But there's 4 sections of davening which happen in the morning, right? So you have Karbanos, Psukkah de Zimra, Shema, and the Amidah. Interestingly enough, if you look at the rest of the day, it doesn't work like that. The rest of the day, in Mincha, we just have Amidah. In Ma'ariv, we just have B'shach B'cha, which is the night part of the Shema and its brachas, and the Amidah. Right? That's all we have. So so the morning is significantly long because of the extra sections, the preamble, which in a certain sense are the preamble to the day as well. Now, you'll notice that in the Psukkah de Zimra, sometimes you'll see that men will get up in the middle of the Psukkah de Zimra and give tzedakah. Why is that? Why are men giving tzedakah in Psukkah de Zimra? The reason is because there's a halacha that before you pray, and pray referring to the Amidah now, is you need to give tzedakah. Why is that? And that is because it's you see some different versions of this in the Hasidic world, is people will accept upon themselves this, the Rav Elimelech Ruzhensk, his Adarab is part of a longer prayer about accepting and loving other people, right? So to be able to pray to God, you need to be mu'urav im abrios, you need to be in tandem with everybody else. But it is also given at that line in the davening, which is V'ato moshel bakol, towards the end of the Psukkah Zimra, that you control everything, including parnasa, which means Hashem, I'm acknowledging that you're driving this truck, and I'm going to be part of the Sfardim. I have a minhag to give 3 coins, specifically if possible during this time. It's a beautiful minhagim which relates to this as well. Why is that Psukkah Zimra is longer on Shabbos? This is so much longer. And the answer is that because Shabbos is a time of rest, we have more of a time to amplify our reflections on Hashem. And you'll notice that all the paragraphs in Tehillim that we add in are about Hashem's running of the global world, right? HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the life of human beings, the praise, the Hallel HaGadol, all these things relate to a longer idea. Why is that? Sometimes you'll notice that the Baal Tefillah will switch at certain times in the davening, right? So before Yishtabach, at Ashrei, right? Why do they switch? That reflects the notion that it's really, there's an importance of a person who is in Avelos, and a person who in mourning lo aleinu, to lead the davening. In fact, the reason why people say Kaddish is called a Kaddish Yasom. Yasom means an orphan, right? The reason the Ramah says is for Kaddish is those who can't daven for the Amud. Meaning a Yasom, a person who is a minor, who's lost a parent, God forbid, they are not allowed to lead the davening. So instead they say Kaddish. But if one has to have a choice, leading the davening is more important than the Kaddish, just to put things into perspective. But there's only one tefillah, and there's sometimes lots of people, right? And so that leads to a complicated state of affairs, and emotionally it's very complicated as well. So Baruch Hashem, we have Kaddish, and people are saying that together in the old good Yekish shuls, right? Remember, it used to be, there was an alternate. Can you imagine how many fights we would be having, right? It's it's a good thing we got rid of that system of rotation, because there's a precedence of who gets, who doesn't get. What is interesting is that so in the davening we try to democratize it as much as possible. We try to give as many spaces to different people, right? So we make splits at the points where we transition in one section and another. So Pesukei Zimra to Kriya Shema is a splitting section. We don't want to split up between Shema and the Shemona Esrei because the Go'al Yisrael, the Geula and the Tefillah need to be adjacent. But we can switch from the brachas Karbonos to Pesukei Zimra and the Pesukei Zimra to the Kriya Shema. Those we can split. And then at the very end, there is a notion of what's called the person who says the last Kedusha. There's three Kedushas in davening, and the last one is in Uvadat Zion, bringing the community to lead them in a state of a response to Dvarim Shabbat Kedusha. That seems a very powerful thing, so we give that to another Avel as well.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
But Yishtabach is really the last part of
Yes.
the Zimra. Why are they not switching after Yishtabach?
It's such a good question. It's really a good question, and this raises a question as well. As let's say you were to put on talis and tefillin. Let's say you daven before the time that you can put on talis and tefillin, and you want to put them on. So when should you put them on? Did you put them on between Yishtabach and the Kaddish and Birkas Kriya Shema? Do you put them in before Yishtabach? It happens to be a debate between the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah. So the Sfaradim should really put it on after Yishtabach, like your suggestion. The Ramah says, and he goes backwards and forwards, he says that actually it's better not to interrupt between Yishtabach and Birkas Kriya Shema, sort of leading in from the praise directly adjacent, even though that the cost is being in the middle of the two brachas of Baruch Shem and Yishtabach. So I don't know fully the reason, but this it seems to be this. The only thing you'll ever see between Yishtabach and Birkas Kriya Shema is during the Aseret Simei Tshuva, we put Shir Lamados. And I remember whenever Rav Shechter would talk about this, because he talks about these halachas, he would always burst out crying at this point in time, and he's saying, because if it's pikuach nefesh, you can interrupt. And what he means to say is that our lives are on the line in Aseret Simei Tshuva, which is why we're allowed to interrupt at such a significant place in davening to pray for our lives. That's what the Shir Amalah says, right? But nonetheless, but generally speaking, that's why we tried to. There is a little bit of glue there, which is also not as simple. Now, you'll notice that some people stand and some people sit for Kaddish, right? So how does that work? That's not just because some people are lazy. In the Sephardic community, people don't sit. What they do is they carry on doing what they're doing. That's what it is. Meaning to say, if you are sitting and there's a Kaddish, you carry on sitting. If you are standing and there's a Kaddish, you carry on standing. Right? But the point is that you follow what was beforehand. Whereas the Ramah says, because it's such a holy thing, you should always make an attempt to stand. So you'll see Ashkenazim are generally stand for Kaddish. Sfaradim usually follow what they were doing just beforehand for Kaddish. And that's why you see many Sfaradim will be sitting for Kaddish at times when the Ashkenazim are not. And that's not because they don't care, that's because that's what the halacha is for Sfaradim. Why is it that there are different lengths of Kaddish? I just keep noticing there's all these different Kaddishes, and the answer is there's different types of Kaddish. The most simple format of the Kaddish is from Yehei Shmei Rabbah to the end of the paragraph, the end of the first paragraph, right? That's the most significant part of Kaddish. Okay, and as an example, let's just take a look at this for a second. So Yehei Shmei Rabbah Mevarach L'Olam Ha'amay, and then the next paragraph Yisparach Yishtabach to Damiran Ba'olamah. Right? That is the central part of Kaddish. It is 28 words long, and it is V'ata Yigdal Na Koach Hashem. This is called the expression of power of Hashem in this world is expressed by us responding to that. The first paragraph is a preamble, talking about what we're about to do, right? Yiskadal v'yiskadash shemei rabbah ba'olma divrach Yerusei. We're about to talk about what we're doing, which is leading to the Yeshmei Rabbah and the Kaddish. That is the central part of Kaddish. Happens to be there's sometimes appendages made at the end. The most basic form of Kaddish is just those two paragraphs, right? And that is done as what we call a Chatzi Kaddish. That Chatzi Kaddish is usually actually a breaker between different sections of davening. Just to notice that is usually placed between different segments of davening. So it's put between Pesukei Zimra and Birkas Kriya Shema. It's put after the Tachanun, which is the tail end of the Shemona Esrei, and the Kriyas HaTorah. Right? It's sometimes put after the Kriyas HaTorah as we move to the Sofa Tefillah. It's really a transition place, a point. That's what the Chatzi Kaddish is. But then you have what's called Kaddish Sholem, the full Kaddish. That's the Kaddish which has one extra paragraph, which is Tiskabel Tzlaosan Uvalsan D'Chol Beis Yisrael Hashem, and that's in Aramaic. Please accept the prayers of Israel. That will only appear one time in davening after the Shemona Esrei, right? Because it's essentially referring back to the davening which was done. It will never appear twice if there's not been two Shemona Esreis. In a day when there's Musaf, you'll have two times because one will be after the Amidah of Shachris, one will be after Amidah of Musaf. But it will never appear twice, which is why, just as a fun fact, for those who've ever davened for the Amud on Chanukah or Rosh Chodesh, and it's a little confusing, what Kaddish do you say afterwards? It depends exactly on this. On Chanukah, there is no Musaf, which means to say how does it work? Yes. On Chanukah, there is no Musaf, so you say Chatzi Kaddish, go into the laning, and after the Asher Volatzil, you do a Kaddish Tiskabel, which is the capstone of your Shachris davening. Then that's where the Kaddish Tiskabel goes, which is why it doesn't go after Hallel. On a Rosh Chodesh, where you have a Hallel, you say Kaddish Tiskabel. Why? Because you're closing off Shachris, because then after your laning, you're going to go Chatzi Kaddish into Musaf with its own Tiskabel. So you don't put a Tiskabel before you start a new Musaf. That's why it's done separately, just in terms of the logic of this. So that's considered as a full Kaddish. You know where you'll find an interesting...
Why do you say it after Asher, though? Why don't you say it before?
Oh, so Asher is seen as part of it. That third Kedusha is somehow included in that, which is a question as to why we should shliach the Shliach Tzibur there, but it's an interesting question. Now, another interesting application of this is the night of Purim and the night of Tisha B'Av. Most people are not aware of this. How does it go? You do Kriyas Shema, you do Shmona Esrei. What happens right afterwards? Kaddish, Tiskabel, and then Megillah, right? So whether it's Megillas Eicha or Megillas Esther, Nahavdil, right? But you do that Megillah. After you do that, there's a few prayers, Kinos on the night of Tisha B'Av, and then a few prayers, Asher Heini and Shoshanas Yaakov, and then Asher, and then Uvol Etzion, right? On the nights. But after that, there's a Kaddish, but you can't do Tiskabel Tzloson because you didn't daven, right? You already did your Kaddish Tiskabel. And people make this mistake all the time. You'll see it's a Kaddish without Tiskabel because there was no Shmona Esrei that it's referring to. Okay? So just to understand that the Kaddish Shalim always goes there. Then there's the Kaddish Yosom. That's the Kaddish which is said primarily after Aleinu, which is for mourners. That's the primary Kaddish, and it is there to express HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There's been a vacuum in this world which is created. We're going to recognize your name and call upon others to recognize your name in the absence of this neshama in the world. And we're doing that in lieu of the person who is absent. There's a much more to that, but that's that Kaddish. And then finally, there's another two Kaddishim which appear. One is what's called Kaddish de Rabbanon. That's after learning, when you learn from Mishnah or Gemara, right? Not Tanakh. If you learn Tehillim, you say a Kaddish Yasam. If you learn Mishnah Gemara, you do a Kaddish de Rabbanon, and there's an extra paragraph. And it's Ali Yisrael Rabbanon Al Tamidei Al Kol Tamidei Tamidei Al Kol Man Daskim Barasa Divasar Adain, and it's a beautiful description of everybody who's learning Torah, and it describes that everybody who learns Torah should be blessed because we're finishing this, and we say that. But then there's a last Kaddish which is called Kaddish de Ischarata, the Kaddish of Revelation. That's usually done at a funeral. And at a funeral, we talk about that in the world that is going to be in the future, you're going to reunify us and bring back the dead. So that's said at such a specific time. Each of them have a quite different function and appear at different times, and that's why there's different lengths as well. What was that?
One more on Siyum.
On the Siyum. And the Siyum is an interesting one because it is the Ischarata with the Drabonon. It's kind of two merged, right? You put it because it's the learning of Torah, and it's also the Ischarata as well, which is not the case at the funeral. It's only the additional first paragraph which talks about the resurrection of the dead, the beginning and the future, which is we don't talk about the Rabbanon and because we didn't learn Torah then, right? That's not reflecting that as well. Eddie.
Kadeshim are usually said by someone who is an availus.
Yes.
But we have a policy in our shul and some other shuls as well that after Rabbi Yishmael and after Aleinu, if there is no Yasam, we still say Kaddish. Why? Okay, good. So so there is the notion of there being a Kaddish at the end of davening. That's the Kaddish Yasam, right? So we need to have a Kaddish as a capstone. It's a closer where we all, before we go out to our crazy days and everything we have to deal with, we make one last verbal commitment together to say, Hey, Shmei, Rabbo. That's how it's supposed to end. We give that to Avelim to have the ability to facilitate that, which is a big zchus, right? So we allow everybody who's an Avelis to be the shliach tzibur for that point at the end of the davening. But if that's absent, we still need that, right? So that's sort of how we close davening. And then, that's one after Aleinu specifically. And then for the Kaddish Rabban, the reason why we try to always make sure that that's there is because that we just learned. We learned Rabbi Shmuel Aimer, Ezu Makaman, and therefore that warrants, after learning a Mishnah, after learning a Brisa, to have the Kaddish which is said as well. When you're in a Chabad place and they say Kaddish every time you sneeze, right? So what they're doing is they have a notion to be Marbe Kaddishim. And what they're doing is that if you know that they say there's the machat and blah, 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 they're learning the last Mishnah, or the last half of Mishnah, if you want to be precise, in Maseches Mikvahs, right?
And they do that in order to be able to warrant another Kaddish Rabbanan, right? Because that's the Mishnah which is learned then as well. In Ashkenazi tradition, the tradition is to limit the amount, to preserve having doing less. In the Chabad tradition is to increase the amount. So you see different traditions as such. And just one interesting point is that let's say at a funeral, and people don't do this right all the time because they just don't know the halachas. That's why you need rabbis, right? Is because is at a funeral, as an example, you can only really say the Kaddish Tischarata after you said Tehillim. People mix this up all the time. They do the Kel Mole, then the Kaddish. You don't say Kaddish after Kel Mole. You say a regular Kaddish after you say Tehillim. You say Kaddish Drabanan after you learn a Mishnah, right? So you have to say the Tehillim before you get to the Kaddish, right? It's not the other way around. And so but the regular Psukim in Tanakh warrant a Kaddish, right? Or prayer. Regular learning warrants the Kaddish Drabanan. So there's rules as to how every different Kaddish plays out. We're doing this all the time, but it's just appreciative to this. Let's see. Okay.
Rabbi,
Yes.
how important is the order, to daven in the order that you said, starting with Karbanos, Flukidizim, etc.? I mean, let's say if you're walking a bit late.
So good. Actually, I want to do a share on this topic, or just by itself, because this is a classic. We all have situations where, and by the way, for many women, this is a typical situation. You walk in at a certain point on Shabbos, like what I do, what I skip, what I catch up, what I not do, there's a lot of laws that relate to this, and so. What to do in these specific situations? There is a value to this. It was set up in a way that is supposed to be in this order. But if you have to make a choice, then tefillah b'tzibur actually is the most important thing, right? Which means to say is being with the tzibur while they're doing the Amidah is the most important thing. So everything else follows suit to that and rearranges around that. However, there is triage because it's not usually a binary 0 or 1. It might be 0.7, right? So how much 0.7 do you get in is the topic of a larger share as to what to do in those situations. We've all been in them, and just to try to figure out what's best, what do I catch up, am I allowed to catch up, when should I catch it up, should I say it during this, can I say it during that? There's a lot of really important questions. I want to do an entire share just on that topic, because it's really no gap. Just the last few questions and we'll close, okay? So just, you'll notice that people, when they do Shema, they keep on covering their eyes. Why are they covering their eyes? Why are people raising their hands during this part of the davening? The reason is because it's the first and most simple reason is its focus. This is the mitzvah d'oraisa. The Torah says this is the place where you do what's called kabbalas ol malchus shamayim, accepting the yoke of heaven. You want to accept the yoke of heaven? You need to do it without distraction. We get so distracted. Oh my gosh, look, I just walked into shul. Look at that. I never noticed that stained glass window, has... not during Shema. So we do this. And by the way, sometimes change allows us to tap into that as well. However, it's more than that as well, is that when we talk about the Malchus of Hashem being Hashem Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, Hashem being one in this world, sometimes we just don't see it. There's a lot of suffering. There's just a lot of things which aren't right. There's a lot of bad guys in power, right? It's just like a lot of stuff going on in the world. So sometimes we have to say to ourselves, the idea of Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad is something we don't fully see yet, right? We're aspiring to the day we can uncover our eyes and the reality matches our belief. Right now, our belief remains cloistered from the complexity of the world. Our job is to try to help bridge that, but in the meantime, there's still a big gap. Another thing is, why do we whisper Baruch Shem Kavod Malchus Olam Ha'ed? And the answer is because it doesn't appear in the Torah at this place. It appears much later on in the Nevi'im, but it doesn't appear in this place. So you look at Parshas Vayeschanan, where Kriya Shema appears, it goes straight from Shema to V'ahavta. So why do we do it? How can we interject any other psukim into these psukim? The reason is because the Gemara tells us in Psachim that when Yaakov Avinu was at his deathbed, he was about to reveal the end of days to his sons, and it was taken away from him. He wasn't able to do that. And so his son said he said, maybe Shemi Yesh Psul Babonai. Maybe that there's going to be one. Maybe it's because my children are not worthy of hearing the end of days. And they said to him, Shema Yisrael, listen, O Israel, meaning Dad. Right? Shema Yisrael, that's his name. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. Just as Hashem is one in your heart, is one in our hearts. Meaning all the complications that we had in our lives and sibling rivalry and the Egypt episode, like all of that, right? We're all here, we're all one, we're all on the same page. At which time Yaakov, realizing that it wasn't because of them, but it was because Hashem didn't want it revealed, in relief responded, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchus Olam Ha'ed. Blessed be the Hashem as it expresses itself in this world. That being the case, with the way it works in halacha is that in deference to the original expression of this, of Yaakov Avinu and his children, we say it, but in deference to Moshe Rabbeinu's rendition of it in the Torah, which is later, where it doesn't have it, we just say it quietly. Make sense? Right? So, the original time this dialogue happened was on the deathbed of Yaakov. The second time it happened was at the end of the desert when Moshe Rabbeinu tells Israel to do this. So we merge both, but we do it silently in respect to Yaakov. There's another reason because the angel's not hearing. There's 6, if you look at the comparison between Yeshayahu and Yechezkel in describing what's called the Maaseh Merkava, the throne room of God, essentially. The first chapter of Yeshayahu, the sixth chapter of Yeshayahu, the first parak of Yechezkel, both they describe God, the angels differently. One describes the angels with 6 wings, and one describes the angels with 4 wings. The reason is because that Yechezkel was living at a time when the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash was happening, as he witnessed it, and Yeshayahu was at the time when the Beis Hamikdash was still around. The pasuk Baruch Shem Kavod Malchusai Le'olam Va'ed has 6 words, right? And it expresses the Kavod Malchusai, the honor of God's Malchus in the world, right? At the times of Yechezkel, those 2 middle words dropped out. We can't say Kavod Malchusai as the Beis Hamikdash is being destroyed, which means the angels went down to 4 wings. They no longer had the full expression of Hashem's glory, which is why they were deficient. So we don't have the right to say Baruch Shem Kavod in a world which is so absent of God's glory, except on one day a year, which is on Yom Kippur, which is when it comes back, because we are talking about the Kavod Malchusai again of Hashem. Folks, I know there's so much more, but we'll hold here just in terms of this is less than a beer Tefillah shir. This is more of a much global perspective. I'll try to appreciate what we're doing. Exactly, Nachon.